Welcome to the deep dive. Let's plunge straight into the ancient world, a place that, despite the millennia, still casts a long shadow over how we think about society, justice, and maybe most surprisingly, politics.
hmm We're talking classical Greece, of course.
Exactly. And two intellectual titans whose ideas really form the bedrock of Western thought, Plato and Aristotle.
Teacher and student
Yeah,
giants, who laid so much groundwork.
they did. But the question before us today, as we explore some fascinating source material, is this. While they're inextricably linked, how different were they really when it came to the messy, practical business of government?
That's exactly the core question, isn't it? It's easy to group them together as the great Greek philosophers, but the source material we're using for this deep dive, it's an academic text focused specifically on comparing their political views. It really pulls apart some pretty significant divergences.
Especially in how Aristotle approached politics, right?
Mhm.
Often as a direct response or, well, modification of his teacher, Plato. And that's our mission for this deep dive. To take this source material, unpack their core political ideas, pinpoint those crucial areas where they diverge, and perhaps most importantly for you listening, understand why these ancient debates still hold remarkable relevance today.
So let's set the stage just a little bit, shall we? Aristotle wasn't actually a native Athenian, unlike Plato. He was born in 384 BC in Stagira,
Stagira, right, kind of on the edge of the Greek world.
yeah, near the Macedonian border. His father was the court physician to the king of Macedonia, King Amyntas II. And this background, potentially giving him a broader view beyond just the Athenian polis, it might have subtly shaped his later, more worldly and practical approach to politics.
Which is wonderfully ironic when you consider that he later became the tutor to Amyntas's grandson,
A young Macedonian
who
prince.
would become Alexander the Great, and Alexander's conquests would eventually dismantle the very polis model that formed the basis of Aristotle's political theories.
History has a funny way of twisting things, doesn't it?
It really does.
We don't know every detail of Aristotle's early life before he came to Plato's academy in Athens, but it's clear he was exceptionally gifted. He spent about 20 years there, becoming Plato's most distinguished student.
20 years is a long time.
It is. But the source highlights that especially in Plato's later years, and certainly after his death, Aristotle began to forge his own intellectual path, diverging from his master.
And there's been a lot of speculation about why he left the academy after Plato died in 347 BC. Some scholars suggest it was precisely this growing intellectual break, maybe tied to not being chosen to succeed Plato as head of the academy.
That's one theory. Others wonder if there was maybe resistance from Plato's more orthodox disciples, people who perhaps saw Aristotle's critiques as a challenge to what they considered the almost sacred ideas of the master.
Like a sort of deification of Plato?
Possibly. What's particularly telling, according to the source, is Aristotle's own intellectual integrity. He would have absolutely resisted any attempt to place Plato's ideas beyond scrutiny.
He sounds like a firm believer in criticism.
Oh, absolutely. Aristotle believed the intellectual life demanded that no thinker, not even figures as revered as Socrates or Plato, should be immune from critical examination. And in his mature writings, he doesn't shy away from critiquing both of them directly.
So, after leaving Athens, he spent some years traveling, including that period tutoring young Alexander,
Right.
before returning to Athens around 335 BC. That's when he founded his own school, the Lyceum, and did much of his most significant work.
A rival school to the academy, in a way.
And he remained there until shortly before his death in 322 BC, when political turmoil forced him to leave again. And the story of that second flight from Athens, the source suggests, is quite revealing about his philosophical temperament compared to, say, Socrates.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
After Alexander the Great's conquests, Athens was effectively controlled by a Macedonian-backed leader, Antipater.
Who happened to be a friend of Aristotle's. Convenient or maybe not so convenient leader.
Exactly. When Alexander died, the Athenians revolted against Macedonian rule, and Aristotle, links and Antipater, found himself in a, let's say, precarious position.
Unlike Socrates decades earlier.
Right. Socrates stayed and faced trial and execution. Aristotle, he fled the city.
And the quote attributed to him explaining his departure is pretty famous, isn't it?
It is. He reportedly said he fled because he did not wish to see the city commit another crime against philosophy.
It's such a stark contrast to Socrates choosing to drink the hemlock rather than compromise his principles by escaping.
This choice, the source argues, speaks volumes about Aristotle's more practical bent. It suggests a deep-seated belief that life itself and the ability to continue philosophical work held immense value.
That maybe it shouldn't be sacrificed purely for an abstract principle or to make a point.
Perhaps. It hints at his broader philosophical approach, which is grounded in the real world and human experience, not just abstract ideals.
So, if he wasn't willing to reduce life to pure philosophical abstraction, does that mean his approach to political philosophy itself was different from Plato's? The source suggests Plato saw it almost as a precise theoretical science.
That's right. The source posits that Plato, perhaps influenced by mathematics, sought a kind of theoretical precision in ethics and politics. Aristotle, however, viewed political science primarily as a practical science.
Dealing with real people.
Exactly. It deals with human beings as they are, in the real world, making decisions, interacting. Life, with all its messiness and complexity, couldn't be forced into the rigid, perfectly logical mold of pure theory.
So political philosophy for Aristotle should offer what?
Guides. Valuable guides for action, yeah. Not unbending, precise dogma.
And this practical attitude translated into his view of politics itself. The source contrasts Aristotle's apparent affection for politics as a necessary, even noble, worldly occupation.
But Plato sometimes expressed disdain for the often unjust realities of political life.
Aristotle wasn't content just pointing out the flaws, was he?
No. Though he certainly analyzed them critically, he was constantly searching for ways to understand them and, where possible, improve them. Not necessarily aiming for some perfect utopian state, but for making real-world politics better.
Okay, but this practical, worldly perspective wasn't just a matter of his personality. The source emphasizes it was rooted in a profound philosophical difference from Plato.
A really fundamental one.
And that fundamental philosophical difference, which the source says is key to understanding Aristotle's politics, is his modification of Plato's theory of forms.
Absolutely fundamental. Remember Plato's theory. Perfect, eternal, unchanging forms, like the form of justice or the form of a bed.
They exist somewhere else.
Right, in a separate, transcendent, intelligible realm, completely distinct from the imperfect, changing material world we inhabit. Our world is just a shadowy reflection, participating somehow in those perfect forms.
The realm of being versus the realm of becoming, the ideal versus the material. I remember that.
Precisely. Aristotle found this separation deeply problematic. His radical departure was to argue that form is not transcendent, but immanent in matter.
Immanent.
Dwelling within. So, the ideal pattern of treeness, the form that defines a tree, isn't off in some abstract realm. It's inherent within every actual messy tree in the forest.
The form of humanness is part of every human being.
Exactly. Not separate.
What immediately strikes me about this is how it seems to sidestep some of the difficulties Plato wrestled with. The source points out this avoids the puzzle of how material things participate in separate, transcendent forms.
Right. If the form is within the thing, the participation problem just disappears.
And it also helps with the problem of change. That was a big one for the Greeks.
Yes, it provides a brilliant solution to the problem of change that perplexed many earlier Greek philosophers and led Plato to separate the unchanging forms from changing matter. If form is unchanging and perfect, how can it be united with matter, which is constantly in flux?
So Aristotle's answer involves potentiality and actuality.
Yes, exactly. Potentiality to actuality.
Can you expand on that using the source's examples? Like the acorn?
Certainly. For Aristotle, matter represents potentiality. It's a state of becoming. It contains the potential to develop towards its form, which is actuality, a state of being, of completeness. Think of an acorn.
Okay, an acorn.
It's not a tree yet. It's a potential tree. But the form of the oak tree is immanent within it as potential. Given the right conditions, that acorn will develop and actualize its potential, becoming a mature oak tree, its form, its actuality.
Like a fertilized human ovum contains the potential to become a fully actualized adult human being.
Exactly. The source references Aristotle's extensive biological works, where species is seen as the form, the actuality that guides the development of living things.
So the form kind of directs the growth.
Right. The fertilized egg of a dog has the potential only to become a dog, because the form of the dog species is immanent within it, shaping its growth.
So the key idea is development, and things developing towards their specific perfection or completeness, their end. And this concept of an end or purpose is absolutely central to Aristotle's philosophy, isn't it? This brings us to teleology.
Yes, teleology. It comes from the Greek word telos, meaning end or purpose. Aristotle insisted that any scientific study, whether it's physics, biology, or political science, must be teleological.
To truly understand something, you need to understand its ultimate end or purpose.
That's the idea.
So studying an acorn from the perspective of the mature oak tree, its purpose is applying teleology.
Precisely. You understand the acorn by understanding what it is becoming. It's telos. And this applies just as powerfully, if not more so, to the study of humankind.
And how does this teleological approach specifically shape his political science? The source stresses the connection between his two most famous works, the Politics and the Nicomachean Ethics.
Right, they're really meant to be read together because they share the same ultimate purpose. The Ethics studies the meaning, purpose, or end, the telos of an individual human life. Happiness, eudaimonia.
Eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing.
Yes, flourishing is a good way to put it. But Aristotle believed these same fundamental questions are the subject of political science because, as the source quotes Aristotle, the end in politics as well as in ethics can only be the good for man.
So for Aristotle, ethics is essentially a branch of political science. Is that fair to say?
That's his view, yeah.
Huh.
Ethics investigates the good from the perspective of the individual person. What constitutes a flourishing life for you? Political science investigates that same good, that same flourishing, but from the perspective of the community as a whole.
Okay, so on that point, the unity of ethics and politics, he's still aligned with Plato.
He is, the source points that out.
But where they diverge is how they study that good, that human purpose. And again, it seems to come back to Aristotle's theory of immanent form.
Exactly. Plato, remember, sought ethical values like justice or courage in those perfect, unchanging, transcendent forms.
Up in the sky, so to speak.
Metaphorically, yes. Aristotle, looking at his immanent forms dwelling within the material world, looks for these values in the actual facts of the human condition, in real human behavior. Ethics, for Aristotle, isn't just abstract theory. It's about real people living real lives.
So the fact that humans behave according to certain moral principles, acting courageously, showing temperance, seeking justice, that's not just random.
No, not at all.
It's part of their natural development. They're unfolding towards their unique end, their telos.
Yes. Just as we study the biological structure and processes of humans to understand their biological form, Aristotle argued we should study their actual ethical behavior and beliefs to understand ethical values like justice. These values are immanent within people's actions, within their development as human beings.
And unlike Plato, who sometimes dismissed common sense beliefs as mere opinion or shadowy reflections of the true forms.
Right, Plato could be quite dismissive of the many.
Aristotle, the source notes, seems to build his understanding of virtues directly from what people actually say and value.
That's a critical difference the source highlights. Aristotle compiles his catalog of virtues, courage, temperance, generosity, justice, and so on, by observing what people praise, what actions they admire, what they see as necessary for a genuinely good and happy life.
So he's looking at what actually works in practice.
In a sense, yes. People practice virtue because they see it works, that it contributes to flourishing. A courageous person is more likely to succeed and be happy than a coward or a foolhardy person. And they think about virtue, they philosophize about it in their own way because they instinctively understand its vital importance to becoming a fully developed human being.
So virtue isn't some rarefied concept only accessible to philosophers. It's the proper end of a human being, something inherent in our potential and actualized through our lives.
Precisely. And here's another major point where Aristotle diverges from Plato. He does not accept Plato's idea that moral virtue is purely identical to knowledge.
Because if you look at real people, just knowing what's right isn't enough, is it? You have to do it.
Absolutely. It requires practice. The source emphasizes Aristotle's unique stress on habit and training. We become virtuous by practicing virtuous actions. It's not just about intellectual understanding.
Like learning an instrument.
Exactly. And the source includes a fantastic analogy from Aristotle to make this point. The moral virtues we do acquire by first exercising them. So men become builders by building, harp players by playing the harp.
By a similar process, we become just by performing just actions, temperate by performing temperate actions, brave by performing brave actions.
That's the one. It grounds it so effectively.
Yeah, it's not just knowing the definition of justice. It's repeatedly doing just things until that way of behaving becomes habitual, second nature.
Yes. Human happiness, that ultimate end or telos, for Aristotle, is the result of reason guiding action, not just reason alone. It's through consistent action that people actualize the form of virtue within themselves.
And his famous conclusion about the nature of virtue is also quite distinct from Plato's approach, that virtue is a mean, the golden mean.
The famous golden mean, yes. Aristotle observed that when you look at the practical, real-world meaning of any virtue, it represents a balance point, a mean equidistant between two extremes, two vices, really.
So courage, for example.
Courage isn't fearing nothing, which is foolhardiness, or fearing everything, which is cowardice. Courage involves applying reason, knowing what should be feared, and acting appropriately in that situation, finding the middle ground.
Which, going back to his escape from Athens, you could speculate that he saw that decision as striking the mean.
Interesting thought.
Between a reckless, perhaps futile defiance, like Socrates' staying, and a complete abandonment of his principles or work.
It's an interesting way to look at it, certainly plausible within his framework. The source reinforces that this emphasis on practice, habit, and finding the practical mean in behavior aligns perfectly with his idea of immanent form.
So virtue isn't an abstract ideal in a separate realm.
No, it's within people's lives, actualized through concrete reasoned action. And the function of political philosophy is to refine and improve our common sense understanding and practice of these virtues, not to discard it entirely for an abstract ideal.
Okay, so these core ethical ideas, happiness as virtue, rooted in reasoned action and habit, actualize through finding the mean, they seamlessly lead into his theory of politics, because politics, at its heart, is just a collective form of reasoned action, isn't it?
That's the key transition, exactly. And here, Aristotle agrees with Plato. The primary function of the state is to foster virtue in its citizens, to help them achieve that state of happiness and fulfillment, the very purposes outlined in the ethics.
And the state doesn't just aim at a good, but the highest good. The source quotes the powerful opening lines of Aristotle's Politics.
Oh yeah, those are foundational.
Every state is a community of some kind, and every community is established with a view to some good. The state or political community, which is the highest of all, aims at a good in a greater degree than any other, and at the highest good.
He's saying the state aims at the virtue and happiness of the entire community. It's not just about individual flourishing in isolation.
And the source explains why the state's end is considered the highest good.
Right. Two main reasons. Firstly, because it concerns the whole community, which Aristotle sees as more important, in a way, than the individual alone. But more fundamentally, because the state, the political community, provides the environment where people can acquire virtue and achieve happiness to a higher degree than in any smaller subordinate community like a household or village.
Okay, this leads directly into his theory of the nature of community itself, seen through that teleological lens.
Exactly. He traces the development of human community as a kind of natural teleological evolution through three stages. You start with the simplest form, the household or family.
The basic unit.
Then multiple households unite to form the village. And finally, multiple villages unite to form the state, the polis, which is the most complex and complete form of community.
So historically, the household and village came first, but teleologically, the state is prior. That sounds a bit counterintuitive.
It does, but that's a classic Aristotelian distinction, and it's crucial to grasp, because the state is the final form, the ultimate end, the telos, towards which all social life naturally tends. The household and village are necessary, earlier stages, but they're incomplete. They're stages leading to the state.
Got it. And just like Socrates and Plato, Aristotle firmly rejected the sophist idea that humans are fundamentally self-interested individuals and that the state is just an artificial invention or contract.
Yes, absolutely rejected it. For Aristotle, it's inherent in our nature. Humans are, by nature, social and political animals, zoon politikon.
Right. Politics isn't just something we do. It's the highest expression of our natural inclination to live together in communities.
That's it.
And because the polis, the state, is this highest expression, it's the place where we can achieve that highest good, that fullest human flourishing. This requires reasoned action, which is why he makes that controversial argument for excluding certain groups.
Right. According to Aristotle's framework, slaves, animals are excluded because they lack the capacity for free choice guided by reason,
which he saw as essential,
and thus cannot participate in reasoned action or attain genuine virtue and human happiness. The source quotes him directly. A state exists for the sake of a good life, and not for the sake of life only.
If life only were the object, slaves and brute animals might form a state, but they cannot, for they have no share in happiness or in a life of free choice. It's a harsh view for us.
Definitely. And it leads to this crucial difference he draws between the household and the state in terms of where this reasoned action takes place.
Okay, what's the distinction there?
The source draws a very clear distinction. The household is primarily concerned with biological existence and economic activity, the tasks necessary for survival and making a living.
Food, shelter, basic needs.
Right. These are rooted in necessity. Eating, sleeping, procreating, labor, managing property. There's a sense of biological or economic compulsion. And Aristotle argued these activities required a specific hierarchical form of rule, the husband ruling the household, much like a monarch.
But the state is something different, something higher than mere survival.
Exactly. The state is the public arena.
Mhm.
People come together here not just out of necessity for survival, but to deliberate and make decisions for the whole community about how they should live.
And this deliberation, this collective decision-making, fundamentally requires debate.
And therefore, free speech.
So speech becomes the preeminent political virtue for Aristotle.
Absolutely. The source highlights its centrality. Politics, as Aristotle understood it, couldn't exist without speech. Animals might have ways of communicating or cooperating like a colony of bees.
Sure, social organization.
But they don't have politics because they lack speech. Reason applied to discussing and deciding on how they shall live together. Speech, for Aristotle, is reason made active.
And because the state relies on free speech and public debate, it has to be organized differently from that hierarchical household structure.
Fundamentally differently. The public sphere, where reasoned debate takes place, demands a kind of equality.
What kind of equality?
Not necessarily our modern notion of absolute universal equality in every sense, but certainly inequality in the sense that the words, the arguments of individuals must be able to count equally for genuine deliberation to occur. Rulership in the state is constitutional.
Based on rules, participation.
Yes, unlike the purely managerial or monarchical rule of the household. The citizenry, in some form, must participate in an equality of ruling and being ruled. This is why, according to Aristotle, the highest virtue and true happiness can only be fully attained within the public arena of the state.
So, seems teleologically that progression from household to state is a movement from necessity to freedom.
That's a key insight derived from the source. Freedom is presented as the defining telos of human social development, and it's essential for happiness. Aristotle believed people's true home, the place where they can most fully actualize their potential as rational, social beings, is the public arena of the polis.
And if you don't engage in political activity,
You're essentially failing to realize your full human potential. You're living a life closer to necessity than to freedom.
like a slave tied to the constraints and necessities of the household.
That's the connection he makes, yes. Slaves are defined by their exclusion from the political arena where citizens meet as equals to deliberate. And this is why Aristotle argued that the purpose of all that household activity, the economic work of providing for needs, is to create leisure.
Leisure, but not just kicking back.
No, leisure isn't idleness for him. It's time free from necessity, time for political activity and other higher pursuits, like philosophy, art, and contemplation. Those who fixate on accumulating wealth for its own sake, pursuing economic gain as their ultimate end.
What about them?
Aristotle sees them as akin to slaves, trapped by necessity. Their idea of freedom isn't the genuine human freedom found in political life.
Okay, that connection between political participation, freedom, and human flourishing is incredibly compelling. But we absolutely must address, as the source does, the significant and, well, unfortunate blind spot in Aristotle's thinking.
Yes, his conclusion that slavery and male supremacy were somehow natural.
Which he used to justify excluding slaves and women from the very political arena he saw as essential for full human life.
Exactly. He argued that, like children, they lacked full rationality based on their exclusion from reasoned action in the public sphere.
And the source points this out as a classic example of what's sometimes called the conservative fallacy.
Right. That's the argument that because a social practice like slavery or the subordination of women has existed over time across different societies, it must somehow be natural or ought to exist.
Taking what is and concluding that's what should be.
The source contrasts this with a more radical perspective like Plato's, where the power of reason and logic can be used to critique and challenge the irrationalities and injustices of the existing world, even if they are long-standing.
But the source makes the case that this part of Aristotle's thought, his defense of these exclusions, is largely conventional to his time.
And can be separated from the core strength of his political theory without discarding the whole thing.
So we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
I think that's the argument, yes. If the fundamental Aristotelian idea, that genuine human flourishing requires participation in the public arena and reasoned action is valid, then it logically follows that any group traditionally excluded from that arena, whether slaves, women, or others throughout history, should be included and encouraged to engage in politics for their full humanity to be recognized.
So his defense of their exclusion is a kind of contradiction within his own system.
In this view, yes, a regrettable contradiction of his own most powerful insights, one we can and must correct.
Okay, moving on, let's look at how he analyzed and classified actual states or constitutions. The source says he viewed the Constitution itself as the form of the state, determining its structure.
Yes, applying that theory of form again. Just as the species is the form immanent within a biological category, a dog's form makes it a dog.
Right.
A constitution is presented as a kind of political species. It's the form that becomes actualized at the final stage of social development, defined what kind of political community it is.
But there's a crucial difference from biology here.
A very important one. A dog can't choose not to be a dog, but humans are not merely biological, they are ethical beings. They choose their social and political arrangements.
And choosing a constitution, the source emphasizes, is the most significant collective choice a community can make.
Because it determines the collective ability to attain virtue and happiness. It sets the stage for everything else.
So specifically, what is a constitution for Aristotle? How did he define it?
According to the source, it's essentially an arrangement of political offices, who holds power, how power is distributed, who gets to participate. Altering who participates in ruling and in what way fundamentally changes the character, the form of the state.
And his basic system for classifying these different forms is quite simple, based on two factors.
Right. It's based on, one, the number of rulers, one, few or many,
Okay.
and two, the quality of rulership. Do they rule in their own self-interest or for the common public good?
This gives us his famous six-fold classification.
Exactly. 3 good constitutions, where the rulers genuinely aim at the public good. Monarchy, ruled by one. Aristocracy, ruled by a few. And polity, ruled by the many.
Polity. We'll need to come back to that one.
Definitely. And then 3 corresponding perverted constitutions, where the rulers rule purely for their own private interest or the interest of their class. Tyranny, ruled by one. Oligarchy, ruled by the few. And democracy, ruled by the many.
Wait, democracy is a perverted form for Aristotle.
In this specific classification, yes. He saw it as rule by the many poor, purely in their own interest, potentially ignoring the law or the rights of minorities. It's not quite what we mean by democracy today. Polity is closer to his ideal for rule by the many.
Got it. And in this classification, monarchy is theoretically the best form of government and tyranny the worst.
Theoretically, yes. The source notes this is quite similar to Plato's own classifications in works like The Republic and Statesman.
It is, and the similarity highlights their shared assumption that there is an objective ethical standard against which states can be judged as good or evil.
Whether it's Plato's transcendent forms or Aristotle's immanent forms, the standard is justice. Good constitutions are ruled justly, aiming at the public good. Perverted ones are ruled unjustly, pursuing private interest.
It directly links back to that fundamental debate in Plato's Republic about the nature of justice and whether ruling is for the benefit of the ruler or the ruled. But while Aristotle presents this ideal classification, his politics isn't just focused on the theoretically best state, like Plato's Republic. It's much more concerned with the best possible constitution under real-world circumstances.
That's a crucial distinction the source makes, and it connects back to his theory of immanent form. Justice isn't just a perfect, unreachable ideal. It's something immanent, existing on a continuum.
Something achievable to degrees.
Right, something that actual communities have the potential to actualize to a greater or lesser degree. Life is dynamic. It's movement and becoming, not static perfection. Constitutions exist on a spectrum from worst to best, and the key is movement towards the better.
And this is why his initial 6 categories quickly become more complex in the politics, because he examines the messy reality of actual constitutions.
Acknowledging that even the perverted ones can exist in various forms and might be improved. You can have better or worse democracies, better or worse oligarchies.
So the task isn't always revolution, but maybe reform.
Yes. The source emphasizes that, for Aristotle, the task of the political leader or philosopher is often to identify how existing institutions can be directed toward greater justice and virtue, to move toward the ideal within the limits of possibility in the real world.
And what did Aristotle see as the most significant of those limits of possibility in the real world? What constrained political choices?
According to the source, while he considered factors like population size, temperament, and geography, social class was the most important limitation.
Social class. This highlights his sensitivity to the economic basis of politics.
It really does.
A point so pronounced that the source mentions some scholars have compared him to Marx, though cautioning it might be going a bit too far.
Yeah, it's an interesting comparison, but maybe overstates it. Still, Aristotle viewed the fundamental conflict within societies as the struggle between the rich and the poor. The distribution of wealth and property deeply shapes the character of the perverted constitutions.
So oligarchy is ruled by the wealthy few in their own class interest. Democracy, in his negative sense, is the equivalent rule by the poor, many in their class interest.
Right.
And tyranny is when one person seizes power, often capitalizing on the unresolved conflict between rich and poor.
Exactly. And Aristotle was quite blunt in admitting that, in reality, people tend to pursue their own class advantage rather than the public good. He wasn't naive about that.
Which brings us back to Plato's radical solution to this very problem, eliminating private property and the family for the ruling class.
To remove the desire and opportunity for self-interested rule.
But Aristotle's solution is fundamentally different.
Completely different. He saw private property as natural and potentially conducive to ethical behavior. He rejected Plato's communism. Instead, he accepted class conflict as a given reality, but believed that even institutions born from this conflict contain both good and bad elements.
You work with what you have.
Kind of. The role of leadership is to identify those good elements and direct them towards justice and virtue.
So the political logic here, tied back to his immanent form theory, is not to deny the complex, often contradictory reality of the world,
As Plato sometimes seemed to do by focusing on the ideal.
but to work within those contradictions to achieve an ethical end.
Precisely. You don't discard the messy reality. You engage with it, analyze it, and work to improve it. This leads him not to advocate for eliminating classes, but for finding a way to balance their competing interests.
And this brings us to polity, the constitution he saw as the best average constitution under most circumstances.
Yes, polity. It's often considered the lowest of the just constitutions, perhaps, but the most practical and achievable. It's a form of democracy where the many participate.
Okay.
But crucially, their rule is constrained by law and genuinely aims at the public good, not just the interest of the poor majority. It's his prime example of a mixed constitution.
Mixed constitution, mixing the principles of democracy and oligarchy.
Exactly. The goal is to constitutionally blend elements of both, so that neither the rich few nor the poor many can dominate purely for their own class advantage.
How do you achieve that balance?
And Aristotle's profound insight, which the source emphasizes, is that achieving this balance requires a large and stable middle class to act as a buffer, a moderating force between the extremes of wealth and poverty.
Yeah.
Polity, in its most stable form, is essentially rule by the middle class majority.
This specific idea about the middle class feels incredibly relevant even today.
It really does, doesn't it? The source notes that modern political scientists often echo this Aristotelian insight, arguing that instability in many developing nations is linked to the absence of a significant middle class, leaving a small oligarchy ruling over a large, impoverished population.
And proposed solutions often involve fostering economic conditions that build a middle class.
Right. Aristotle's idea that a political solution might lie, in part, in the social and economic structure of a society persists. It's quite remarkable.
So the theory of the mixed constitution itself is a hugely important contribution.
It is, and the source highlights two key lessons from it. First, it serves as a caution against a fanatical devotion to any single pure form of government.
Don't be too rigid.
Exactly. Even rule by the many democracy can become tyrannical, as Aristotle noted in his sixfold classification. The task is often to temper the potential excesses of one form by mixing in principles from others.
Like the example the source gives of the American Constitution, which mixes democratic principles, like the elected House of Representatives.
With elements traditionally seen as more aristocratic, like appointed Supreme Court justices with lifetime tenure, acting as checks and balances.
That's a clear, modern example of this ancient idea at work.
It is. And second, the mixed constitution illustrates Aristotle's pragmatic view that politics isn't a simple division between good and evil forms. A just state, the polity, can actually be created by mixing elements of two potentially unjust constitutions, oligarchy and democracy.
Two wrongs making a right. Sort of.
In his teleological framework, combining aspects of two wrong forms can indeed lead to a right outcome. Yeah, it's about finding a stable, just balance.
And again, this complex, nuanced, and realistic approach to the world's political messiness ties back to his theory of immanent form. Achieving political justice requires a sophisticated analysis of the various types of real constitutions, not just striving for an abstract, rational ideal.
This complexity also leads him to a deeper look at political justice itself, beyond just balancing class interests. The source contrasts Plato's idea that the just state is ruled by philosopher kings.
Individuals whose wisdom and lack of selfish desire make them the embodiment of justice.
Right, Aristotle's view. While such perfectly virtuous rulers are theoretically possible, they are, he argued, highly improbable in reality. The most likely and practical just forms are aristocracy or polity.
So if you don't have the philosopher king, what takes their place in these more probable just states? What ensures justice?
Law. This is Aristotle's key idea. In the absence of the perfect philosophic ruler, law serves as the best practical substitute. He famously described law as reason unaffected by desire.
That description, reason unaffected by desire, sounds remarkably similar to how Plato might describe the form of justice itself, or the mind of a true philosopher king.
It absolutely does. The source points out that on this fundamental point, that justice means reason unaffected by desire, they actually agree. Their disagreement is on the means to embody this standard in the state.
How so?
Plato, at least in the Republic, rejected law because it is general and inflexible, potentially constraining the wise ruler who knows the perfect decision for every specific case.
Law can be a blunt instrument.
Right. But Aristotle saw the rule of law as the closest practical way to ensure just rulership in the real world, accepting its generality as a necessary safeguard against the passions and self-interest of human rulers.
Better than relying on finding a perfect person.
Perhaps. The source notes that even Plato, in his later works like The Statesman and Laws, moved towards accepting the rule of law as the best practical approximation of ideal rule. So maybe they weren't so far apart in the end on this.
Okay, so justice as the rule of law is one meaning for Aristotle. What's the other important meaning of political justice?
It's closely tied to equality, but again, it's a conception quite different from our modern idea of absolute equality. For Aristotle, political justice means proportional equality.
Proportional equality. How does that work in a state? What does that mean?
It means that in a just state, power, office, and rulership should be distributed or allotted proportionate to political virtue or ability.
Based on merit.
Essentially, yes. Remember how we discussed that politics requires free speech, and free speech requires a kind of equality and equal chance to speak and be heard in the public debate. It logically follows from this, for Aristotle, that those who demonstrate the greatest ability to reason and speak well, those with the most political virtue, ought to hold higher office and have greater influence. His ideal is an equality of opportunity that leads to a proportional distribution based on merit or talent.
And how do you identify that political virtue or talent? How do you know who has it?
By observing people's public speech and action. Politics, for Aristotle, serves not just as a forum for decision-making, but also as a kind of testing ground, a process for identifying and selecting the citizens who possess the greatest political abilities. Performance in the arena, so to speak.
And how does this idea of proportional equality connect back to the rule of law?
The source shows they are fundamentally linked. It quotes Aristotle. It is just that among equals everyone be ruled as well as rule, and therefore that all should have their turn.
Ruling and being ruled in turn.
Yes. We thus arrive at law, for an order of succession implies law, and the rule of law is preferable to that of any individual. A state that organizes itself according to this principle of proportional equality, where citizens rule and are ruled in turn based on merit, is a state structured by the rule of law.
So the system itself promotes justice.
It helps ensure that public-spirited people rise to positions of influence and provides a legal framework that constrains rulers to act for the common good, even if they are not perfect philosopher kings. It's a practical check.
Okay, we've discussed Aristotle's theoretical best constitution, monarchy, his practically best constitution, politaristocracy, the rule of law, and proportional equality based on participation. But there seems to be inherent tension here, doesn't there?
How so?
Well, he says monarchy is the best, theoretically, rule by one, excluding participation. But then his arguments about the need for participation, reasoned action in the public sphere, rule of law, and proportional equality seem to strongly advocate for systems like aristocracy or polity that involve broader political participation.
That tension is definitely present, yeah. And the source addresses it by explaining that monarchy is presented as an ideal theoretical form, but one that is very rarely practical or achievable in the real world.
So it's like a thought experiment almost.
Perhaps. Aristotle's advocacy, his focus in the politics, is on aristocracy and polity, precisely because they do allow for that wider political participation, which he described in the Ethics as necessary for a virtuous and genuinely happy life.
So he prioritizes the systems that enable that essential human activity of politics. He prefers aristocracy over the theoretical ideal of monarchy because aristocracy allows for real life of political action.
Yes, exactly. And within the realm of practical constitutions, he tends to favor the form of polity that comes closest to aristocracy rule by the virtuous few, but including broader participation.
And vice versa.
And also favoring aristocratic constitutions that incorporate those balancing democratic principles from the polity. Why? Because the polity, the mixed constitution, gives the greatest scope to diverse political action and participation, which he saw as central to human flourishing. His practical preference clearly leans toward systems that maximize effective, reasoned participation.
So, zooming out from the specifics, what are Aristotle's most enduring contributions to Western political thought that the source identifies? What's the legacy?
The source points to several core ideas that have become almost foundational and are often unconsciously accepted in modern political thinking. Things like the value and importance of political participation itself.
Just taking part is important.
Right. Then, the ideal of the rule of law as a check on arbitrary power. The theory of the mixed constitution as a way to achieve stability through balance, and that crucial insight about the role of the middle class in fostering a stable political community.
These are big ideas that still shape debates today.
Absolutely. And central to understanding the originality and impact of his thought is that core contrast with Plato, particularly Aristotle's fundamental criticism of Plato's ideal republic.
What was the main criticism?
Right. His most significant criticism was that Plato's ideal state suffered from too much unity. Aristotle argued that the true nature of a good state is not a forced unity, but plurality.
Plurality, meaning diversity.
Diversity, difference, yes. Plato, in his quest for harmony and the common good, seemed to want the state to resemble a large family unified hierarchical, where individual distinctions are subsumed into the whole. But Aristotle argued the state is fundamentally different from the household.
How so?
It's a public arena that requires different kinds of people, organized on a basis of equality and plurality, not strict hierarchy like the family.
And this is why he so strongly rejected Plato's communism for the ruling class, because it aimed for too much unity.
Exactly. In Aristotle's view, Plato's communism aimed at dissolving the very individual distinctions and the potential for political equality and reasoned action that he saw as essential for public life.
So Plato missed a key distinction.
He criticized Plato for failing to adequately distinguish between the private realm, the household, driven by necessity and organized hierarchically, and the public realm, the state, the sphere of freedom, equality, and reasoned political action.
And Plato's ideal state was too much like a household.
That was Aristotle's critique. By trying to be like a giant unified household, it might aim for a singular common good. But in doing so, Aristotle believed it destroyed the very possibility of public life itself, which he saw as the genuine source of the highest common good, of virtue, and of happiness.
What's particularly insightful, and something the source brings out, is how Aristotle's criticism of Plato's excessive unity connects to the idea of the tyranny of reason, sometimes leveled at Plato's ideal republic.
The tyranny of reason. Explain that.
Well, a singular focus on pure reason and rigid deductive logic can lead one to seek only one perfect truth or structure, potentially ignoring the inherent complexity and variety of life, trying to force everything into one mold.
Yeah, I see. And the source suggests that Aristotle's theory of immanent form was what allowed him to escape this potential tyranny of reason and the push towards excessive unity.
How did immanent form help?
By uniting form with matter, being with becoming, the ideal with the real, he could connect the actual complexity and plurality of real-world politics with an ethical standard. This was something Plato struggled with, even in his later, more practical works like the Laws.
So Aristotle managed to bridge that gap.
Arguably, yes. Aristotle's true originality lay in recognizing that the complexity of human life and society demanded political plurality, and that this didn't undermine the search for a just and virtuous state. He modified Plato's philosophy, bringing the ideal down into the real.
So, after exploring all this, is one thinker, Plato or Aristotle, definitively superior? Does the source weigh in?
The source wisely concludes that declaring one superior is ultimately a matter of judgment, or perhaps intellectual temperament.
Depends on what you value.
Pretty much. Aristotle's theory is perhaps more practically useful for a leader grappling with concrete political problems. You'd likely pick up the Politics over the Republic for that kind of guidance. But the Republic might arguably be superior for understanding certain fundamental theoretical questions about politics, about justice itself.
So it comes down to being more of a pragmatist versus more of a rationalist. Is that a fair summary?
Broadly speaking, yes. The source describes pragmatists, like Aristotle, as those who appreciate complexity and plurality, are comfortable with imperfection, a little skeptical of rigid ideals, and highly value the lessons drawn from experience and tradition, the experience of the ages.
They often lean conservative.
Tend to, yeah. Rationalists, like Plato, are drawn to pure theory and abstract ideals, impatient with the compromises and messiness of the real world, and often critical of existing politics when it falls short of the ideal.
They tend to lean radical.
That's the tendency.
But despite these different temperaments and approaches, they share deep common ground. You mentioned that earlier.
Absolutely. They both fundamentally believe that ethics and politics are inseparable, and that politics is a human endeavor aimed at a distinctly human good, a flourishing life, eudaimonia. The difference is more about where they place their emphasis, the ideal versus the practical, transcendent versus immanent, unity versus plurality.
And both approaches carry potential dangers, right? The source mentioned that.
That's the final crucial takeaway from the source. The danger of radicalism, Plato's potential pitfall, is that in striving for a pure ideal state, you might ignore the realities of human nature and society and propose reforms that are unrealistic or even destructive.
Trying to fit square pegs in round holes.
Exactly. And the danger of conservatism, Aristotle's potential pitfall, is that in accepting the real world as it is, you might end up justifying things that are fundamentally unjust or wrong, simply because they are long-standing practices.
Falling into that conservative fallacy we talked about, assuming that what has always been is what ought to be.
As Aristotle unfortunately did with slavery and male supremacy.
Right.
Precisely. The radical impulse, the Platonic side perhaps, can challenge those unjustified practices by appealing to a higher ideal or a more consistent application of reason.
So the lesson for us from comparing these two giants is to temper our own political leanings, find a balance.
That's the source's concluding thought, pretty much. If you lean radical, listen to the conservative warnings about a complexity of changing the world and the dangers of imposing rigid ideals. If you lean conservative, take seriously the radical critique that the ideal can be better than the real, and that not everything that exists or has always existed is necessarily just or good.
It's a call for intellectual humility and maybe a synthesis of perspectives.
I think so.
So, reflecting on this deep dive into Aristotle's political philosophy, especially contrasted with his teacher Plato, we've explored Aristotle's grounding in practical reality, his theory of immanent forms and teleology, his view of the state as the arena of freedom where reasoned action leads to virtue and happiness.
The importance of speech, the mixed constitution, the rule of law as a substitute for the ideal ruler, and the vital role of the middle class.
Right. And we've also acknowledged the unfortunate blind spots that reflected the conventions of his time. Yet, despite being formulated over 2 millennia ago, these ideas are incredibly influential. They shape, often invisibly, how we discuss government, justice, and what constitutes a good life lived together in a community.
They really do. Aristotle's genius was in bringing philosophical analysis down to earth, engaging with the messy details of actual human behavior and political systems while still holding on to an ethical vision. The contrast with Plato's more transcendent, unified ideal highlights just how original and practical Aristotle's contribution was.
And thinking about Aristotle's argument that genuine human happiness and the full actualization of our potential requires participation in the public arena, reasoned action, and deliberation, what does this suggest to you, listening right now, about the health of our political communities today and our own individual responsibility within them?
That's a big question.
How do our modern social realities, the ways we structure our lives, our economic activities, and how we choose to spend our time measure up against his vision of the purpose of economic activity being to provide the leisure necessary for political life and other higher pursuits?
It certainly leaves us with some profound questions to consider, doesn't it? Especially about what we prioritize.
Something to ponder as you observe the political world around you and think about your own place within it. We hope this deep dive has given you a richer understanding of these ancient thinkers and why their ideas continue to resonate.